There's a retail chain you can just walk into and buy something from. First, you have to pay for the right to enter. That sounds like an absurd business idea, charging the customer money before they've spent a single dollar on groceries. But that exact paradox is the foundation of one of the most profitable and durable retail systems in the world. The company is Costco, and its economics work not despite this paradox, but because of it. To understand why it works, you first have to understand how ordinary retail operates, the kind we're all used to. A typical supermarket or big box store survives on markup. It buys product cheap, sells it dearer, and the gap between those two numbers is its profit. To make more money, a retail chain essentially has two levers: raise the markup on each item, or increase the number of items it sells. That's exactly why an ordinary supermarket keeps expanding its assortment: 10 kinds of ketchup instead of 1, 20 toothpaste brands instead of 5. The logic is simple. More choice means a higher chance the shopper finds something they're willing to overpay for, and more line items on which to stack a markup. Costco does almost the opposite. And that opposite is worth taking apart piece by piece. Start with the most obvious element: membership. To walk into a Costco warehouse, a shopper has to buy an annual card. This isn't a loyalty bonus or an optional subscription for discounts. It's literally a condition of entry. Without the card, a person physically cannot get through checkout with a product. At first glance, this should repel customers. Why pay the company money for the privilege of paying it even more money? But hidden inside, this is the first, and most important, shift in business logic. An ordinary store earns money on the gap between wholesale and retail price. Costco builds a significant share of its profit not into the product itself, but into the fee for access to it. That changes the entire reason the company exists. If a retail chain earns primarily through markup, it has a constant incentive to raise that markup quietly, gradually, item by item. But if a substantial chunk of profit is already locked in through the membership fee, that incentive disappears. The company doesn't need to squeeze an extra dollar out of every can on the shelf, because the money has already arrived through a different channel, paid in advance, a year ahead, for the right to be inside the system at all. This isn't altruism, and it isn't customer-friendly branding for its own sake. It's arithmetic. The annual membership fee creates a predictable, stable stream of revenue that doesn't depend on how much any individual person buys on any given day. And because that revenue already exists, the company gains a freedom most retailers don't have. It can hold markup on merchandise artificially low, almost at cost, and still remain profitable. That raises the next logical question. Why would a shopper pay for a card at all, when they could just walk into an ordinary supermarket with no membership required? The answer isn't emotional loyalty to a brand, it's cold calculation. If a person shops regularly enough and in large enough quantities, the savings from Costco's lower prices over a few months more than cover the annual cost of the card. In effect, the shopper strikes a deal with the company. I pay you a fixed amount up front, and you guarantee me below market prices for the rest of the year. That turns a one-off transaction into a long-term relationship. And it's that relationship, not any single shopping trip, that becomes Costco's real product. Now, the second pillar of the system, the limited assortment. Here it's worth remembering again how an ordinary supermarket is built. It stocks thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of unique items. Every shelf is a compromise between competing brands of the same product. Several types of cooking oil, several detergent manufacturers, several shampoo lines. To the shopper, this looks like freedom of choice. To the store, it means something else: fragmented purchasing. Instead of buying an enormous volume of one product, the chain buys moderate volumes of dozens of similar products, and its bargaining position with each individual supplier ends up weaker. Costco deliberately cuts the number of listings down to a bare minimum. A typical warehouse carries a fraction of the unique SKUs an ordinary large supermarket does. Instead of 10 kinds of ketchup, 1 or 2. Instead of 20 paper towel brands, 3. This isn't a poverty of assortment or a limitation of the buyer's capability, it's a deliberate strategy of concentration. When a company decides to sell not 10 versions of a product, but one, the entire pool of demand that would otherwise be spread across competitors' funnels into a single purchasing line. That means Costco can approach a manufacturer and offer to buy not a small batch, but a colossal volume, one that's predictable, because the assortment stays stable year over year. In supplier negotiations, volume is leverage. A manufacturer asked to sell 1 million units under a single contract will concede far more on price than one being asked for 100,000 units split across 5 different chains separately. So the limited assortment isn't an aesthetic choice, and it isn't an attempt to simplify the shopper's life, though that's a pleasant side effect. It's a lever of pressure on the supply chain. Fewer listings mean more volume per listing, which means a stronger negotiating position, which means a lower wholesale price. And it's that lower wholesale price, not the magic of membership on its own, that lets Costco keep retail prices low without raising markup at all. It's worth pausing here to connect these two mechanisms, because neither one on its own explains the system fully. Membership gives the company an independent source of profit that removes the pressure to earn on every single item. The limited assortment gives the company purchasing power that physically lowers the cost of goods. Together, they create a situation where Costco can hold markup at the bare minimum and still be one of the most profitable retail companies in the world, because the profit isn't made on the margin per item, it's made on turnover volume and access fees. Next comes a third element, the company's private label, Kirkland Signature. It's worth separating a myth from the reality right away. Kirkland isn't some secret source of hidden super profit disguised as a cheap brand. Its role is different and more interesting. When a shopper walks into a store with a limited assortment, they have fewer chances to choose between well-known national brands. That creates a risk. The person might conclude that if there's no choice, the quality must be lower. Kirkland Signature exists to solve exactly that trust problem. The private label is often manufactured under contract by the same factories that produce name brands, frequently to comparable or even higher quality standards, but sold without the marketing, advertising, and middleman costs usually baked into a brand name price. For the shopper, Kirkland becomes proof. If the company's own product is just as good while being cheaper, then the whole system is working as promised. Costco is genuinely passing scale-driven savings onto the customer instead of pocketing them. It isn't a side business, it's a mechanism for validating the entire model. Every can of Kirkland on the shelf is a small piece of evidence that a narrower selection doesn't mean lower quality, and a lower price isn't a catch. That principle underlies the next, less obvious but arguably most important element of the whole system, price discipline as a form of trust. Retail in general is a business with very weak transparency for the customer. An ordinary person can't compare a product's wholesale cost to its retail price and judge whether the markup is fair. They're left relying on impression, reputation, habit. In that environment, retail chains often exploit that information asymmetry against the shopper. Prices creep up quietly, markup gradually widens, promotional discounts mask a broader price increase elsewhere. Costco built the opposite reputation, a reputation as a company that keeps markup artificially capped regardless of market conditions. Internally, the company has long held an informal but firmly enforced rule. Markup on any item shouldn't exceed a small fixed percentage above wholesale cost, no matter how much higher the market price for that item could be elsewhere. Even when the underlying cost of a product rises, the company will more often shrink its own profit on that item than break this unwritten ceiling. The symbol of that discipline became the famous hot dog and soda combo at Costco's food court, a price that stayed unchanged for decades despite inflation and rising food and labor costs. This isn't the story on its own, and it isn't the company's core secret, but it's an easy, legible signal to the shopper. If a company is willing to hold a price at a loss on something as small and symbolic as this for years, it's plausible the same discipline governs everything else on its shelves. That signal functions as a psychological anchor of trust for the entire rest of the pricing strategy. And this is where the whole system closes into a loop. The shopper trusts that Costco's prices are honest because they see symbolic proof of discipline. That trust makes them renew their membership year after year without cross-checking every purchase against prices elsewhere. Stable membership renewals give the company a predictable revenue stream independent of merchandise sales. That revenue removes the need to earn on margin. The absence of that need keeps prices low. Low prices reinforce the trust, and the loop repeats. That's exactly why this model is so hard to copy piece by piece, even though the mechanism itself isn't a secret and has been described at length in business literature. A competitor can introduce a paid membership, but without matching purchasing discipline and a narrow assortment, the fee just becomes an extra irritant for shoppers with no real economic payoff. A competitor can open a big box warehouse with bulk packaging, but without purchase volume comparable to Costco's. The cost of goods stays higher, and a low price means real losses instead of a result of scale. A competitor can launch a private label, but without decades of a reputation for honest pricing behind it, shoppers will read it as just a cheaper, possibly lower quality alternative, not as proof of transparency across the whole system. The problem is that none of these elements produces the effect on its own. The effect only appears when membership, limited assortment, purchase volume, private label, and price discipline all operate simultaneously for years without exception. This is a system, not a set of tactics, and it's exactly that systemic nature that makes it hard to replicate. A competitor can't borrow one piece and expect the same result, because each piece only exists as part of a larger mechanism that props up the rest. But it would be inaccurate to present this model as flawless or without weaknesses, and it's worth looking at the system honestly, without idealizing it. The limited assortment is an advantage for a typical shopper making large, repeat purchases of household staples, but that same limitation becomes an inconvenience for anyone with niche or specialized needs. If someone needs a specific medication brand, a specific clothing size, or a specific product for a dietary restriction, there's a good chance it simply won't be in Costco's narrow assortment, and they'll have to go to another store anyway, after already paying the membership fee. The bulk format packaging at the core of the company's economics doesn't suit everyone either. It's cost-effective for large families, small business owners, and people with enough storage space. But for a single shopper or someone in limited housing, buying in those quantities can mean not savings but spoiled food and wasted money, meaning the model is structurally built around a particular type of household, not a universal one. There's also a more systemic risk: dependence on discipline. The model only works as long as the company genuinely holds markup at a minimum and doesn't cave to pressure from the market, from investors, or from short-term earnings expectations to raise margin on merchandise. The moment the company decides to loosen that discipline even slightly, say, to boost quarterly profit under shareholder pressure, it risks breaking the exact element the entire trust cycle depends on, and with it, the whole cycle of membership renewals. This isn't a hypothetical threat, but a structural vulnerability. The more successful the company becomes, the stronger the financial pressure to gradually widen margin, and the more important it becomes to resist that pressure as a condition of the model's own survival. Finally, the dependence on volume means the system is sensitive to scale. The bargaining power with suppliers exists only because Costco can guarantee enormous purchase volumes. If growth in store count or membership growth slows down, purchase volume per location won't keep growing at the same pace, and part of the price advantage over competitors could gradually erode. A model built on scale structurally needs that scale to keep growing in order to preserve its main competitive edge. Put it all together, and Costco's story isn't a story about a cheap hot dog, and it isn't a story about one lucky business idea. It's a story about what happens when a retail company deliberately gives up the most obvious source of profit, markup on merchandise, and replaces it with a different revenue source that changes the very nature of the relationship between the store and the customer. Once profit stops, depending on how much can be squeezed out of any single purchase, the company gains something rare in retail: a genuine incentive for the price to actually be fair, not just look that way. This isn't an altruistic model, and it isn't charity disguised as business. It's a calculation in which customer trust turned out to be a more valuable long-term asset than one extra point of markup on a jar of mayonnaise. And that's what makes Costco an interesting case. Not because it sells things cheaply, but because it found a way to make low prices a structural part of its profit instead of a threat to it.